Hello again. I am really excited to introduce you to my favorite instrument, the saxophone. So give me a little bit of time and I'll get my saxophones put together and away we go. Hello. As promised, this is Saxophone Week. Saxophone happens to be my very favorite instrument. I have lots of saxophones. Saxophone is what I studied in college. I'm so excited to tell you about the saxophone. First off, you didn't get to see any saxophone in last week's symphony video because saxophones are typically not invited to the symphony. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why? Or, Mr. Dramstad, that's not fair. And I totally agree with you, it's not fair. But the saxophone was invented in about the mid-1800s, 1840, 1860, and by that time there were already hundreds of years worth of compositions for orchestra. And so when the saxophone was finally invented, people didn't want to go back and change all that music, so they just said, we're going to just leave the saxophone out. Which is sort of sad, except for the saxophone gets to play in lots of cool places besides the symphony. Saxophone is a band instrument. You'll hear it in concert bands, you'll hear it in jazz bands. Every once in a while the saxophone is invited to the symphony, but it's more like a guest star instead of a regular character. There are a couple different kinds of saxophones I would like you to know about. This one right here is my favorite. This is the tenor saxophone. This is not the typical saxophone you're going to start on if you start saxophone in 6th grade. That instrument is the alto saxophone. This is the alto saxophone. If you choose to play saxophone in middle school, this is going to be the instrument you start on in 6th grade. This is the instrument that I started on in 6th grade, and I switched to tenor in 7th grade. Now, alto is a little bit smaller than tenor is. And if you can imagine, there's one instrument even bigger than a tenor and even smaller than an alto. Unfortunately, I can only show you one of those today. The instrument that is a little smaller than the alto saxophone is called the soprano saxophone. And right away, you're going to probably notice two things. First off, this is a different color. Instead of being shiny gold, this is shiny silver. And really, that doesn't matter at all. The color of the instrument is like the least important thing about it. The other big difference I hope you're noticing right away is the shape. These other saxophones, the alto and the tenor, they're kind of curvy. This one is almost perfectly straight. That helps it play in tune a little bit better. You can find soprano saxophones that are all curved up like an alto, but they end up being smaller than an alto, so they kind of curve right about here. So, soprano saxophone is not an instrument you're going to play in middle school. I started playing it at the very end of high school, but only because I put in a lot of time and effort studying the other two. Soprano is usually not an instrument you start playing until late high school or maybe college. So, all three of these saxophones are members of the woodwind family. And that's sort of a confusing name because if you look, you're probably thinking, well, Miss Dramstad, that instrument's made out of metal. And you're correct. All these saxophones are made out of metal, even though they're a member of the woodwind family. However, there's this little part on the saxophone, the sound-making part, that is made out of wood. That kind of yellowish white thing, that's a reed, and that's a really thin piece of wood. And when you blow air through the instrument, that reed vibrates back and forth, and that is what makes the sound on the instrument. It sounds like this. And when you put that sound through the rest of the instrument, you can start moving all these buttons and changing the sound. That's what a saxophone sounds like. So that's what the alto saxophone sounds like. If I play the exact same thing on the tenor saxophone, it's going to sound different. Pressing down the exact same buttons, this saxophone has a lower, more mellow sound than the alto saxophone. The bigger the instrument, the lower the sound. There are saxophones even bigger than this tenor saxophone. The most common one is a baritone saxophone. I don't own one of those, but if you have ever watched The Simpsons, it's the kind of instrument that Lisa plays. Let's try playing that same exact song on the soprano saxophone this time. You notice that the soprano saxophone sounds a lot higher because, of course, it's a smaller instrument than the alto saxophone. Do you remember how I said that saxophones don't usually get to play with the symphony orchestra? That's sort of a drag. But one thing that saxophones do get to play in is a saxophone quartet. You might recognize the word quartet as meaning 4 people playing together, and that's exactly what a saxophone quartet is. When you have a saxophone quartet, you typically have one person playing soprano, one person playing alto, another person playing tenor, and a 4th person playing baritone saxophone. I'm going to link you to a saxophone quartet recording so you can see and hear what all 4 saxophones sound like playing together. Now, a quartet is a small group of musicians called chamber music. There are also large ensembles of saxophones, typically just called saxophone ensembles, that sometimes have 5, 10, 20, 40 people all playing saxophone together. I'm also going to send you a link to one of those, and if you listen carefully to that performance and watch carefully, you might see that you'll see saxophones even smaller than the soprano saxophone, and some much bigger than the tenor. That's because the saxophone family actually has 8 saxophones in it. They just keep getting smaller from the soprano and larger from the tenor. If we were together at roster learning about the saxophone, now is when I would show you exactly how the saxophone makes sound. So I'm going to do my best to show you over video. It might not work that well. So remember this kind of wooden part? That's called the reed. And when you put the mouthpiece and the reed into your mouth and blow, the reed vibrates back and forth. That's what makes the sound. Now I can do something that is pretty silly looking and pretty silly sounding, but if you watch super carefully, you'll actually be able to see this wooden part move. So let's see if I can do this with my tenor. I want you to watch the very tippy top part of this mouthpiece, okay? And it might sound pretty strange. Are you watching? Here we go. Can you see it moving back and forth? That's the reed vibrating. And when that happens, when you're playing the saxophone, those vibrations echo through the mouthpiece and through the neck, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger as the saxophone gets wider and wider. Then it goes through the main part of the saxophone, and it just turns into the sound that you normally hear as being saxophone. But it really does just start with this kind of squeaky sound. Isn't that cool? I love it. So, quick review. Saxophones come in different sizes. Saxophones, even though they are made out of metal, are part of the woodwind family. And if you're a 5th grader thinking about playing saxophone, please know that you're probably going to start on an alto saxophone. And as you get good at the alto, if you decide that you want to try new things, that is definitely an opportunity you will have as you get lots of practice in on your instrument. I hope you check out the links I'm putting below this video, because there are 2 really cool recordings of what saxophone quartet and saxophone ensemble can sound like. I picked the quartet because I think it's just really beautiful playing, and I picked the ensemble performance because it's sticking with a theme. You'll definitely know what that theme is after you do your first physical education lesson this week. And I think your library lessons this week are also going to be on that same theme. So, happy listening. I miss you lots. Have a great day. Bye.